purpose of this video is to demonstrate how to add authentication to a web app, and we're going to be using OAuth type authentication against Google. And we're going to start out with an application, basically a simple one-page application. It has a form, the user fills out the form, and the contents of the form are recorded as a document in a MongoDB collection. And what we want to do ultimately is, well, initially the application, anybody can access the form and fill it out, but eventually we want to get to a place where somebody has to be logged in order to access that application. So what we are going to do is make a copy of the skeleton application. And this application has two components to it, a React front end and a Feathers back end. And the first thing we're going to do is build the front end. So do yarn install followed by a yarn build. Maybe while this is going on, we can start on the back end as well. So I'm going to go back to, in this case, the project directory and the back end folder. And in order for this to work, you'll have to set, so the MongoDB collection, you'll have to set up your MongoDB URI environment variable in advance. I've already done that, but I am going to install the dependencies. And we should be able to run the application. Oh, not quite yet. We got to wait for the front end build to finish. Okay, and the front end's done as well. So back in the back end folder, we can now run this application. Oh, I see. I did the install in the front end, but not the build. Here we go. And let's try the running the back end one more time. Looks like maybe I didn't set the database URI. Just 1 second. Okay, so that looks like it does the trick. So we will preview the application, and there it is. So right now, unrestricted, I can fill out the form, add the items. The application doesn't show the current list, but if we go into the MongoDB database, let's just make sure that that adds. And there it is, perfect. So that part is working. Okay, so what we want to do, so right now the application is unrestricted. Anybody can land on this page and fill out the form, add an item, and it goes into the database. What we want to do is restrict this page so that only a registered user or a logged in user can access it. And so what we're going to do is on the Feathers backend, we are going to create a new service. So I'm going to just stop the application from running, and we will run Feathers generate service. And this is going to be a Mongoose service. And we're going to call this more items. And that path is fine. And for this service, we are going to require authentication. And the generator goes off and generates the required classes and TypeScript files for us. And we're going to make a few changes to the generated files. So in the models folder, source models, we had this definition for those shopping list items, a description, which was a string, and a quantity, which was a number. So we're going to replicate that for the more items service. And just I've got a note here to just have a look at for the more items service, to just look at the hooks for that service. And you'll notice, unlike items, so if we look at items hooks, so basically completely unrestricted. The difference with the more items service is there is this hook function that runs before any other service, find, get, create, and so on. And in order to access this service, the client has to authenticate first. So we won't be able to execute any of these methods without authenticating first. And the change we're going to make, I'm just going to close these up for the time being. The change we're going to make to the front end, just so we can see this working or not working, is for the front end, I'm going to go into the shopping list component, and it used to utilize the items service. So the items service is the unguarded service. We don't need to log in to access that. So I'm going to change this to more items, which is the service that does require authentication. We will save that change, and I'm going to have to rebuild the front end. So we'll do that first. And restart the Feathers backend. And I'm going to do a hard refresh on the web app. And we're going to show the console here so that you can see what's going on. And let us fill in an item. Apples 4. Add an item. And what we get back in this case is an error. So we have the client, it's trying to utilize the Feathers backend service for more items, and so it does a post, which is the kind of the REST create operation, and what comes back is there's an exception thrown, and you can see by the error message that the problem is that that the user was not authenticated. So we tried to access the service without being authenticated. If we go back into the database and look at the more items collection, nothing is contained within it because we weren't authenticated on the client side. Okay. So that's just to convince you that that the service is configured correctly to require authentication. So now we're going to add a few components to the front end side just to handle the situation where a user is not logged in and allowing them to log in and then allowing them to access the form. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a new component. So new file, and we're going to call this loading.js. And really simple component, so a simple React component for that. And the only thing this component does is really just displays a message to indicate that the application is loading. The reason we need this is there's kind of a bit of a delay between when the required client-side scripts are loaded and when the application becomes available. So we'll just use that. And we need a second component that is going to allow us to log in. So I'm going to make a new file called login.js. And for the time being, I am just going to have it display a message. So we've got a loading page and a login page. The last change I'm going to make in this step is to change the application component. And whereas the application component used to go straight to the shopping list component with the form, what we're going to do now is have the application component pay attention a little bit more to the application state, whether there's a user logged in or not, and directing them to the appropriate component. So I'll maybe just replace all of that and walk through it with you. And so now instead of just having the shopping list, we've also got the loading component, the login component. We have a module that contains the code that we're going to use in order to connect to the Feathers backend service. So we bring that in here as well. Whoops. Bring that in as well. And the application now has a little bit of state associated with it, initially empty, and the render method, instead of going straight to the shopping list, which is what it used to do, it now has a look at the state of the application. And so if the state of the application is kind of brand new, then we display the loading component. If someone is already logged in, then we can display the shopping list. And then the third scenario is where the application is loaded and ready to go, but the user is not logged in, and so in that case we would display the login component. So now I've made those changes. I can go back and rebuild the front end. And do a hard refresh on the application so we pick up all those front end changes. And now where we end up is on the loading page. And so just to go back to the code, so in this case we define an empty state, so the login property is not going to be in the state, and so the application is in this undefined state, and so it displays the loading component. So it's doing the right thing so far. Okay, the next thing we are going to do is try and authenticate the user initially when the application loads. And so we're going to add another method to the application class, the component did mount method. And when kind of the front end is set up, we want to try and authenticate the user to the application, and that is going to set the state. So let's add that method in here. So there it is. So the component builds, it becomes available in the UI, so that triggers the component did mount method. And what we do right away is client, so that is the Feathers client. We invoke the authenticate method. And if there is an error, we are going to set the login property, but it's going to be initially a null. So this would be the situation where we are unable to authenticate the user directly from Java JSON web token. So that's one possibility. So if that is the case, then we will get on to the, well, I guess what's the third alternative. So this .state.login is going to be null, and so we will show the user the login page. So we will save this and rebuild the front end. And we will do a hard refresh on the application, and now we are seeing the login component. So this is going to display the controls that the user is going to interact with to log into the application. So right now we just have some placeholder text. Let's replace that with something that's going to do some actual work for us. And so I am going to go, so this is for the login page. Right now it just displays a simple message. So we are going to replace this with a button. So now it's going to return, well, it returns a link styled as a button, and I should tidy this up a little bit. And when somebody clicks on that link, they are going to go to the OAuth Google route or path for the application. And in the case of a Feathers application, what that is going to do is trigger a login interaction with a Google OAuth web application. So we'll save that, rebuild the front end. And refresh the application. And so now we've got that button to log in with Google. So I can click on this now, but it's not going to work because I have not defined the OAuth application in Google. And so it just didn't work for us in this case. So that is going to be the next step. So I'm going to open up a new tab onto where I can configure an OAuth web application in Google. Oops. Let's try that again. So this is the credentials page in the Google Cloud Platform. So we are going to create new credentials. The type we want is an OAuth client ID so that our application can access the registered user's data. It takes me straight to the place where I would create a new OAuth ID. If you've never done any of these before, you're probably going to end up on a page that asks you to create an OAuth consent screen, and you have to give it an application name, your email, an authorized domain name, a home page for the application, and that sort of stuff. So you can fill that in. It's not too critical exactly what goes in there for the time being. It would be more critical for an application in production where you actually want to display to real users appropriate information about your application. So you may have to set that up. And then you're going to get past that. Then you're going to create the OAuth client ID. We're going to identify the application type, which for our purposes is a web application. We are going to have to give it some kind of name. So CBSE 2650 test 3. And the other important thing on this page is to identify the authorized redirect URI. So a user is going to attempt to log in, they will be redirected to a Google page. They will authenticate themselves to Google, and then we want them to be returned to our application. And this is where we would identify where the user is going to end up. So that is going to be based on, let me just back up here a little bit. So that is really going to be based on the domain name for our application. So we can use the development domain name, but later on, of course, you'll probably deploy this application somewhere. You'll have a more permanent domain name for it, and you can add that in at the time as well. So what this is going to look like is it's going to be certainly based on that domain name for the running application, and I will paste that in. We have to redirect the user after the successful authentication to a particular URI on the application in order that it can pick up that authentication information. And so in this case, for a Feathers application using OAuth and Google, we are going to put in something like that. So the domain name of the application, and OAuth Google callback. And then we can go ahead and create the application. And a couple of values are going to be produced, a client ID and a client secret that we are going to use in our application. So I'm going to go back to our application, and I'm going to put those credentials in the config directory for, or sorry, the config file for the backend. And so I've highlighted, in the sample application, I've kind of highlighted where these values go. So it's the key and secret respectively. The client ID is the key, not particularly sensitive, so you can certainly put that in the source code, so I will do that. For the secret, that is probably something that you wouldn't necessarily want in your managed source code. So we are going to get this from an environment variable. So Google OAuth secret. And I'm going to have to define an environment variable for that. So let's go back to where the backend is running. Stop it. Export Google OAuth secret equals, and then let's grab that from the credentials, and there we go. And I think that's it. I mean, there's going to be, well, yeah, there is a bit more that we're going to have to do. We have to add some additional values just to make sure everything is going to work correctly with the domain name of the application. And so the first thing is we are going to change the OAuth redirect property to again be based on the domain associated with our application. And the other thing we're going to have to do, we're going to have to add in the OAuth Google section, we're going to have to add several other properties with different URIs, domain names, callback paths, and so on, just to make sure everything is going to work correctly. So I'll paste those in. And we really need to fix these up so that everything matches with the actual development domain name in this case. So we've got the OAuth redirect property, the redirect URI, the host, and the callback. I guess the callback will remain unchanged. And your OAuth client ID and associated secret. You can put the ID right in the source code. The secret, though, of course, that's sensitive, so it should probably come from an environment variable. So we'll make those changes. And one final change, we will go to the authentication module for the entire Feathers application. It's set up to use JSON Web Tokens and local authentication. What we want to do is add in the capability of using OAuth through Google as well. And in the Feathers documentation, there's an example of using GitLab and OAuth. We can basically model our solution on that. So I'm just going to grab that page. And there is some code there. So this is the contents of the of the Authentication JS module, we're doing TypeScript. I'm basically going to grab the whole thing and overwrite what we have here, which is kind of the stock authentication module. And the example in the documentation is for GitHub, using OAuth with GitHub. We are going to be using Google. I'm just going to change the class name, and obviously we have to change the corresponding class name here. And the last thing we need to do is register. We're not using a GitHub OAuth strategy. We're using a Google OAuth strategy. And so that's the only other change we have to make. It's basically identical. I mean, all the OAuth providers are going to be pretty much the same. They will be like this. Okay. Okay, so now I think we've made sufficient changes to the back end so that it should get us a little bit further along. And let's restart the back end. Front end, I can't remember whether I made any changes in the front end or not. I'll just rebuild it in case. And restart the back end. And now it's running. We'll do a hard refresh. Okay, so it still takes, I mean, we're seeing the same page, so we are not authenticated to this application. We are going to click log in with Google. And if this was a production application and the user wasn't logged into Google already, they would be taken to the Google page, they would authenticate, and then be returned to this application. In my case, already logged into my Google account, so it detects that and kicks me right back to the application. However, we're not getting to the final shopping list page yet. We just come back to that landing page. So we were redirected to Google, the authentication piece happened, we're redirected back to the application. We still have to make a couple more minor changes in the front end to get this completed. So I'm going to go back to the application class. So I think I can close these for the time being. And there's one change left in the application class. So when the component mounts, so when the front end JavaScript and HTML is ready to go, we try and authenticate. If we are unable to, then we set the login state to null. The other piece we are going to add in here is an event handler to deal with the eventuality when the user does eventually become authenticated, and we are going to update the login state. So we're just in that same method, we're going to add a bit more code. And so client refers to the Feathers client. We try to authenticate right away. If there's an error, we update the login state to null. At some time later, the user is going to follow that login button, authenticate with Google. They will get kicked back to the application, and we will rerun this method. So it'll do a client authenticate again. That will be successful. And in that case, we set up an event handler. So when the user does end up being authenticated, there's a callback function. It takes in a login parameter, and now we can update that login state property for this component. So it's initially null. The user logs in, and we update the state with that data. So we can go ahead and save this, and it's in the front end, so we're going to have to rebuild the front end. And that should be it. So I'm going to do a hard refresh on this page, and there we are. We have we got back into the application. So I'll add some information here. So we're going to do pairs 27, add the item, and no errors. So that that item should have gotten added to the database. We'll go back and just double check that. So it's in the more items collection in this case. And there they are, pairs 27. And the other thing I should mention is there is another service that that this application is using. So there's items, there's the more items, which are the ones that are guarded for people that are logged in, and there is the users service. So when somebody does, in this case, authenticate through OAuth using Google, there is also a record of that. So there is a service that maintains a list of active users, and it contains the information about those users. Primarily, we're interested in the email, but the only way someone ends up in this users table is if they have gone through the steps to authenticate against Google and then get redirected back to our application. And that's it. So that's how you can add authentication to a web application. So in this case, we were using a Feathers backend and its support for authentication generally, and we configured the application to perform OAuth authentication against Google in this case. And yeah, and that's it.